Convinced of his victory, the millionaire groom sent a wedding invitation to his poor ex-fiancée just to see her suffer. But on the big day, she showed up, not alone. By her side stood 3 children, identical to him. In an instant, his triumphant smile vanished, replaced by the shock of a devastating truth that would change his life forever. The Texan sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling grounds of the Langston estate, a palatial residence nestled in the heart of Fort Worth's most exclusive neighborhood. Edward Langston stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his study, his steely gaze fixed on the manicured lawns where an army of workers scurried about, preparing for what promised to be the wedding of the decade. At 45, Edward cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that only added to his distinguished air. His custom-tailored suit whispered of wealth and power, a testament to the empire he had built from the ground up. "Mr. Langston," a hesitant voice broke through his reverie. "The florist is here with the sample arrangements." Edward turned, his piercing blue eyes landing on his assistant, a petite woman who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Tell them to wait," he said, his voice clipped. "I'm not quite finished here." As the door closed softly behind her, Edward's attention returned to the envelope on his desk. The cream-colored paper was thick, expensive, a perfect match for the opulent celebration he was planning, but it wasn't the quality of the stationery that held his focus. It was the name elegantly scripted across its surface, Naomi Carter. His fingers traced the letters, a mix of emotions flickering across his face. Anticipation, anger, and something deeper, more primal that he quickly suppressed. With a decisive motion, he slipped the invitation into the envelope and sealed it. "Let's see how you like this, Naomi," he murmured, a cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's time you saw exactly what you walked away from." Across town, in a modest but cheerful bungalow in the eclectic near Southside neighborhood, Naomi Carter stood before an easel, her brush dancing across the canvas in swift, sure strokes. At 42, she was a vision of quiet beauty, her deep brown skin glowing, her curly hair pulled back in a messy bun, streaks of paint adorning her worn jeans and oversized t-shirt. The living room around her was a testament to both her talent and her life as a mother. Colorful abstract paintings hung on the walls, interspersed with crayon drawings and school certificates. Toys were scattered across the floor, evidence of the whirlwind that was raising 3 9-year-old girls. "Mom," a voice called from the kitchen, followed by the sound of bickering. "Olivia won't let me have the last cookie," Naomi sighed, setting down her brush. "Girls," she called back, her voice firm but warm. "What did we say about sharing?" She made her way to the kitchen where she found her daughters, Ava, Olivia, and Sophia, engaged in a standoff over the cookie jar. Despite their identical features, the same warm brown eyes, the same curly hair, the same button noses, their personalities were as distinct as could be. Ava, the peacemaker, stood between her sisters, trying to mediate. Olivia, the firecracker, clutched the jar protectively. And Sophia, the dreamer, looked on with a mixture of amusement and longing. "How about we split it 3 ways," Naomi suggested, reaching for the cookie. With practiced ease, she broke it into equal pieces, handing one to each girl. There, problem solved. As the girls munched contentedly, Naomi's gaze drifted to the calendar hanging on the fridge. A date was circled in red, the day of her art show at a local gallery. It was her big break, a chance to showcase her work to serious collectors. But as her eyes moved to the pile of bills stacked neatly beside it, she felt the familiar weight of worry settle in her chest. "Mom?" Sophia's voice pulled her back to the present. "Can you tell us a story about Dad?" The question, innocent as it was, sent a jolt through Naomi. She looked at her daughters, their eyes wide with curiosity, and felt her heart constrict. How could she explain the complexity of her relationship with their father? How could she tell them about the man who didn't even know they existed? "Your father," she began, choosing her words carefully, "was a man with big dreams. He wanted to change the world. Is that why he's not here?" Ava asked, her voice small. "Because he's out changing the world." Naomi swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "Something like that, sweetie. But remember, just because he's not here doesn't mean he wouldn't love you if he knew you." As the girls nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, Naomi felt a familiar pang of guilt. She had made the choice to keep their existence a secret from Edward, believing it was for the best. But as the years passed, that decision weighed on her more and more. Later that evening, after tucking the girls into bed, Naomi sat at her small desk, sorting through the day's mail. Bills, junk mail, a flyer for a local art supply store, and then something unexpected. An envelope thick and expensive, with her name written in an achingly familiar hand. Her heart racing, she opened it, already knowing what she would find inside. The invitation was ornate, dripping with luxury. Edward Langston and Emily Foster cordially invite you to celebrate their union. Naomi's hands shook as she read the words, memories flooding back unbidden. She remembered the Edward she had known, passionate, driven, but also selfish and unyielding. The man who had swept her off her feet, only to leave her feeling invisible in the shadow of his ambitions. She thought of the day she had left him, her heart breaking but her resolve firm. She thought of the weeks that followed, the shock of discovering her pregnancy, the agonizing decision to keep it a secret. And now, years later, here was Edward, reaching out across the chasm of time with an invitation that felt more like a challenge. Why now? Why invite her to his wedding? The Edward she knew wasn't one for sentimentality or closure. No, this was something else. A show of power, perhaps. A way of saying, look at what you gave up. Naomi's gaze drifted to the photographs on her desk, her beautiful girls, laughing and carefree. In that moment, she made a decision. She would go to this wedding, not for Edward's sake and not to satisfy his ego. She would go for her daughters, to finally give them the chance to know their father, whether he was ready for it or not. As she penned her RSVP, Naomi felt a mix of determination and trepidation. This would change everything. But as she looked at her sleeping daughters, she knew it was time. They deserved to know their father, and Edward deserved to know the amazing young women he had helped create. Little did Naomi know, miles away in his luxurious penthouse, Edward was nursing a glass of scotch, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips as he imagined Naomi's reaction to the invitation. In his mind, he saw her face crumpling with regret, saw her realizing all she had given up. He couldn't wait to see that look in person, to feel the vindication he had been craving for years. But life, as both Edward and Naomi were about to discover, had a way of upending even the best-laid plans. As the sun set over Fort Worth, casting long shadows across the city, the stage was set for a reunion that would shake the foundations of both their worlds and change the course of their lives forever. The bustling streets of downtown Fort Worth faded into a blur as Edward Langston's sleek black Audi R8 weaved through traffic. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as memories of a time long past flooded his mind. It had been over a decade since he'd allowed himself to truly think about Naomi Carter, but now, with his wedding day looming and that fateful invitation sent, the floodgates had opened. He remembered the first time he saw her, standing in front of one of her paintings at a small gallery opening. She was radiant, her dark skin glowing under the soft gallery lights, her eyes alive with passion as she explained her work to a captivated audience. Edward had been drawn to her immediately, not just by her beauty, but by the fire that seemed to burn within her. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Edward, already on his way to building his real estate empire, had been used to women who were impressed by his wealth and ambition. But Naomi was different. She challenged him, pushed him to see the world through different eyes. She introduced him to the vibrant art scene in Fort Worth, dragged him to hole-in-the-wall jazz clubs, and showed him the beauty in the simple things he'd always overlooked. For a while, it had been perfect. Edward found himself opening up, allowing the softer side of himself to emerge. He'd spend hours watching Naomi paint, marveling at the way she could bring a blank canvas to life. They'd talk late into the night about their dreams, his of building a business empire, hers of touching people's lives through her art. But as Edward's business began to take off, the cracks in their relationship started to show. He worked longer hours, missed gallery openings, forgot dinners. Naomi tried to understand, to be supportive, but she couldn't help feeling like she was losing him to his ambition. The memory of their last fight hit Edward like a physical blow. He could still see the hurt in Naomi's eyes, as she accused him of caring more about his next deal than about her. He remembered the frustration he felt, the inability to make her understand that everything he was doing was for their future. "You're building a future I don't want to be part of, Edward," she had said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep trying to fit into your world when you won't even try to be part of mine." He had let her walk out that day, too proud to go after her, too convinced that she'd come back once she calmed down. But she never did, and he had buried himself in his work, using his pain as fuel to drive his ambition even further. As Edward pulled into the parking garage of his office building, he shook off the memories. He had moved on. He was marrying Emily Foster in a matter of weeks. Emily, who understood his drive, who fit perfectly into the world he had built. So why couldn't he shake this nagging feeling of unfinished business? Across town, Naomi sat on the worn couch in her living room, a photo album open on her lap. The triplets were at school, and in the quiet of the house, she allowed herself to revisit the past she usually kept locked away. Her fingers traced over a photo of her and Edward, taken at the Kimball Art Museum. They were both laughing, Edward's arm around her waist, her head tilted back in joy. It was hard to reconcile that image with the man she knew Edward had become, the cold, ruthless businessman whose name was splashed across the society pages of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Naomi's mind wandered back to the day she left. She had been so sure it was the right decision, even as her heart broke. Edward had become consumed by his work, and she felt like she was disappearing, becoming nothing more than an accessory to his success. She couldn't bear the thought of losing herself, of becoming someone she didn't recognize. But then, just weeks later, came the shock of discovering she was pregnant. Naomi closed her eyes, remembering the mix of terror and joy she had felt. She had picked up the phone a dozen times, her finger hovering over Edward's number, but each time she put it down again. She knew Edward, knew his single-minded focus, his inability to compromise when it came to his goals. Her baby, let alone 3, would derail everything he had worked for. So she had made the hardest decision of her life. She would raise these children on her own, giving them all the love and attention that she feared Edward couldn't or wouldn't provide. The early years had been a blur of exhaustion and joy. Naomi had moved to a smaller apartment, taken on freelance graphic design work that she could do from home, and poured every ounce of energy she had into her daughters. There were nights when she'd collapse into bed, every muscle aching only to be woken an hour later by a crying baby. There were moments of doubt, of wondering if she had made the right choice. But then, there were the moments that made it all worthwhile. The first time each of the girls smiled, their first words, first steps, the way they'd crowd around her easel, eyes wide with wonder as she painted. Naomi had found strength she never knew she possessed, driven by the fierce love she felt for her daughters. As the girls grew, the challenges changed. There were school fees to consider, extracurricular activities to juggle. Naomi took on more work, often painting late into the night after the girls were asleep. She became an expert at stretching a dollar, at finding creative ways to give her daughters the best life she could. But there was always a shadow, a sense of something missing. She saw it in the way the girls would sometimes fall silent when their friends talked about their dads. She felt it in the questions they'd ask, becoming more pointed as they grew older. Why did Dad leave? Didn't he want us? Each question was like a knife to Naomi's heart. She had always been honest with them, in an age-appropriate way, but she knew that one day she would have to tell them the whole truth. And now, with Edward's wedding invitation sitting on her desk, it seemed that day had finally arrived. Meanwhile, Edward's life had taken a very different path. His business acumen had paid off, and Langston Real Estate had become one of the most successful firms in Texas. He had properties across the state, his name synonymous with luxury and success. From the outside, his life seemed perfect. But in quiet moments when the deals were done and the accolades had been given, Edward felt a gnawing emptiness. He had everything he had ever wanted, and yet something was missing. He threw himself into his work with even greater fervor, as if he could fill the void with more success, more wealth. It was at a charity gala that he met Emily Foster. She was the daughter of a prominent oil tycoon, educated at the finest schools, groomed for a life in high society. She was beautiful, poised, and most importantly, she understood the world Edward inhabited. Their courtship was everything Edward thought he wanted. Emily was supportive of his work, happy to attend business dinners and charity events on his arm. She never complained about late nights at the office or last-minute cancellations due to work emergencies. She fit seamlessly into the life he had built. And yet, as they planned their lavish wedding, Edward couldn't shake a sense of déjà vu. He found himself comparing Emily to Naomi, noting the differences. Where Naomi had challenged him, Emily acquiesced. Where Naomi had pushed him to try new things, Emily was content with the familiar. One evening, as they sat in his penthouse reviewing seating charts for the wedding, Edward found himself staring out the window, his mind elsewhere. "Edward?" Emily's voice cut through his reverie. "Are you listening? We need to decide where to seat the Johnsons." Edward turned back to her, forcing a smile. "Of course, darling, whatever you think is best." Emily frowned, setting down her pen. "What's going on with you lately? You seem distracted." For a moment, Edward considered telling her about Naomi, about the invitation he had sent, but he pushed the thought away. There was no need to complicate things. This was just a final bit of closure, a way to prove to himself that he had made the right choice all those years ago. "It's nothing," he said, reaching for her hand. "Just wedding jitters, I suppose." Emily smiled, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. "Well, don't worry. Everything is going to be perfect. I've made sure of it." As Emily launched back into a discussion about flower arrangements, Edward felt a twinge of something. Regret? Longing? He pushed it aside. This was the life he had chosen, the life he had worked so hard to achieve. He wouldn't let old ghosts derail him now. But as the days ticked by and the wedding drew closer, Edward found himself increasingly on edge. He snapped at his assistants, second-guessed business decisions, and spent long hours staring at his phone, wondering if Naomi would RSVP. When the response finally came, a simple yes written in Naomi's flowing script, Edward felt a jolt of emotions he couldn't quite name. Anticipation, certainly. Anxiety, perhaps. And underneath it all, a current of excitement he didn't want to examine too closely. As the sun set over Fort Worth, casting long shadows across the city, both Edward and Naomi found themselves standing at a crossroads. Naomi gathering her courage to reveal a decade-old secret that would change lives forever. Edward, unknowingly on the brink of a revelation that would shake the very foundations of the life he had built. The stage was set, the players in place. In just a few short days, at a wedding that promised to be the social event of the season, the carefully constructed worlds of Edward Langston and Naomi Carter would collide, and in the aftermath, nothing would ever be the same. The morning of Edward Langston's wedding dawned bright and clear, the Texas sky a brilliant blue that seemed to mock the turmoil brewing beneath its peaceful expanse. In his penthouse suite at the Omni Fort Worth Hotel, Edward stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his bow tie with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "You look perfect, darling." Emily's voice floated from the adjoining room. "The photographer will be here in an hour. Are you nearly ready?" Edward cleared his throat, forcing his voice to remain steady. Almost, just a few final touches. As he smoothed down his lapels, Edward caught his own gaze in the mirror. The face that stared back at him was one he barely recognized, taut with tension, eyes shadowed with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Was it anticipation, dread, or something else entirely? His mind drifted to Naomi. Would she really come? And if she did, what then? He had invited her out of a perverse desire to showcase his success, to prove that he had moved on and up in the world. But now, on the brink of this momentous day, he found himself filled with a strange sense of unease. Across town, in a modest bungalow that couldn't have been more different from Edward's luxurious suite, Naomi Carter was engaged in a whirlwind of activity. The house echoed with the excited chatter of her daughters as they prepared for the day ahead. "Mom, can I wear the blue dress?" Ava called from her room. "No fair. I wanted to wear blue," Olivia protested. Naomi took a deep breath, centering herself amidst the chaos. "Girls, remember what we talked about? We're wearing the dresses we picked out together. Ava, you're in lavender. Olivia, you're in mint green. And Sophia, you're in pale yellow." As she helped her daughters dress, Naomi's mind raced. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head, imagined every possible scenario, but now that the day had actually arrived, she felt woefully unprepared. "Mom?" Sophia's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you okay? You look worried." Naomi knelt down, meeting her daughter's concerned gaze. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little nervous. Today is a big day for all of us." "Because we're going to meet our dad?" Ava asked, joining them. Naomi nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "That's right. And I need you girls to remember what we talked about. No matter what happens today, we're a family. We have each other, and that's what matters most." As she helped the girls with their hair, Naomi caught sight of herself in the mirror. She had chosen a simple, elegant dress in deep burgundy, her hair swept up in a sophisticated updo. She looked poised, confident, but inside, her heart was racing. Back at the Omni, the pre-wedding festivities were in full swing. The hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a vision of opulence, with cascading floral arrangements, shimmering crystal, and accents of gold leaf that caught the light. Guests mingled, admiring the decor and speculating about the power couple about to be united. Edward stood at the center of it all, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with a practiced smile. But his eyes kept darting to the entrance, watching for a face he hadn't seen in over a decade. "Edward?" Emily appeared at his side, resplendent in her designer gown. "Is everything all right? You seem distracted." He turned to her, forcing his attention back to the present. "Of course, darling. Just taking it all in. You look beautiful." As Emily beamed under his compliment, Edward felt a twinge of guilt. She deserved his full attention on this day of all days. He resolved to put thoughts of Naomi out of his mind and focus on the woman he was about to marry. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as the wedding planner began ushering guests to their seats for the ceremony, a ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Edward, engaged in conversation with his best man, didn't notice at first. But then he caught sight of Emily's face, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at something over his shoulder. Time seemed to slow as Edward turned, and there, standing in the doorway like a vision from the past, was Naomi. But she wasn't alone. Flanking her on either side were 3 young girls, their resemblance to both Naomi and Edward unmistakable. The room fell silent, 100 pairs of eyes darting between Edward and the new arrivals. Edward stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. And yet, Naomi took a deep breath and stepped forward, her daughters moving with her like a single unit. Her eyes locked with Edward's, and in that moment, a decade of secrets and unspoken words passed between them. "Hello, Edward," Naomi said, her voice carrying in the hushed room. "It's been a long time." Edward opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His gaze moved from Naomi to the girls, taking in their familiar features, his nose, Naomi's eyes, a perfect blend of their skin tones. "What is the meaning of this?" Emily's sharp voice cut through the silence. She moved to Edward's side, her eyes flashing with anger and confusion. "Edward, who are these people?" Edward swallowed hard, his world tilting on its axis. "This is Naomi," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. We were together years ago." "And these girls?" Emily demanded, though the answer was written clearly on their faces. Naomi stepped forward, her chin held high. "These are our daughters, Ava, Olivia, and Sophia. They're 9 years old." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Edward felt as though the floor had disappeared from beneath his feet. Daughters. He had daughters. 3 of them. How was this possible? "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me?" Naomi's expression softened slightly. "It's a long story, Edward. One I think we need to discuss privately." But privacy was a luxury they didn't have. The whispers had turned to a dull roar as guests speculated wildly about this unexpected turn of events. Edward was vaguely aware of his wedding planner trying to herd people out of the room, of Emily's parents converging on them with looks of outrage. "Is this some kind of joke?" Emily's father boomed. "Because if it is, it's in very poor taste." "It's not a joke," Naomi said firmly. "I'm sorry for the disruption, but Edward deserved to know the truth, and our girls deserve to know their father." The triplets, who had been quiet until now, began to fidget under the weight of so many stares. Olivia, always the boldest, stepped forward. "Are you really our dad?" she asked, her young voice cutting through the chaos. Edward felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. He looked at the girl, at his daughter, and saw himself reflected in her determined gaze. Slowly he knelt down to her level. It seems that I am," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't know about you. Any of you." Ava and Sophia moved closer, their curiosity overcoming their shyness. Edward found himself surrounded by 3 pairs of eyes that were achingly familiar, a perfect blend of his and Naomi's. "Edward!" Emily's voice was shrill with panic. "What is going on? You can't possibly believe this." He stood slowly, feeling as though he'd aged a decade in the span of minutes. "Emily, I need to talk to Naomi, to understand what's happening." Emily's face crumpled, a mix of hurt and anger washing over her features. "On our wedding day, you're choosing to do this now?" The guilt that flooded Edward was overwhelming, but it was overshadowed by an urgent need to understand, to make sense of this earth-shattering revelation. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "I need to do this, I need to know." As Emily stormed off, followed closely by her parents, Edward turned back to Naomi and the girls. The room had mostly cleared now, leaving them in a bubble of tense silence. "We should go somewhere private," Naomi suggested gently. "The girls and I can wait while you take care of things here." Edward nodded numbly, his mind reeling. He watched as Naomi ushered the triplets to a quiet corner of the room, their matching dresses a splash of pastel against the opulent decor. His daughters. The thought sent a jolt through him every time it crossed his mind. The next hour passed in a blur. Edward moved on autopilot, speaking with the wedding planner, instructing her to inform the guests that the wedding was postponed. He endured a blistering tirade from Emily's father, accepted the shocked condolences of his best man, and tried to ignore the curious stares and whispers that followed him. Through it all, his gaze kept drifting back to Naomi and the girls. They sat quietly, Naomi speaking softly to them, her hands moving in soothing gestures. Even in the midst of chaos, she was a picture of calm strength. It was one of the things that had first drawn him to her all those years ago. Finally, with the ballroom empty save for a few shell-shocked staff members, Edward made his way back to his newfound family. The word felt strange even in his thoughts. Family. He had spent so long convinced that his ambition, his success, was enough. But now, faced with these three young lives he had unknowingly helped create, he felt the foundations of his world shift. "I've arranged for us to use a private meeting room," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We have a lot to talk about." Naomi nodded, standing and gathering the girls. "Yes, we do." As they made their way through the hotel's plush corridors, Edward felt as though he was walking in a dream. The weight of his tuxedo felt oppressive, a reminder of the life he had been about to commit to just hours ago. Now everything had changed. The meeting room was small but comfortable, with a round table and soft leather chairs. Edward watched as Naomi helped the girls get settled, noting the easy way they responded to her guidance. He felt a pang of something, regret, envy, at the realization of all he had missed. Once they were all seated, an awkward silence fell. The girls looked between Edward and Naomi expectantly, while the adults struggled to find a way to begin this impossible conversation. Finally, Edward cleared his throat. I think I need to understand how this happened. Why you never told me, Naomi?" Naomi took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It's not a simple answer, Edward. When I left you, I didn't know I was pregnant. By the time I found out, weeks had passed. I knew how focused you were on your career, how much you wanted to succeed. A baby, let alone 3, would have derailed everything you were working for." Edward felt a flash of anger. "That wasn't your decision to make. I had a right to know." "You're right," Naomi admitted, her voice soft. "Looking back, I know I should have told you, but at the time, I was scared. Scared of how you'd react, scared of being a mother, scared of losing myself in your world. So I convinced myself that it was better this way, that I could give them the love and attention they needed, without asking you to change who you were." The girls listened intently, their young faces serious as they tried to understand this complicated adult situation. "But why now?" Edward asked. "Why come to the wedding? Why not just keep things as they were?" Naomi's gaze drifted to the girls, a small smile playing on her lips. "They've been asking about you more and more. They deserve to know their father, and you deserve to know them. When I got your invitation, it felt like a sign, a chance to finally make things right." Edward sat back, his mind whirling. He looked at the girls, his daughters, and felt a surge of emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. There was anger at Naomi for keeping this secret, confusion about what this meant for his life, and underneath it all, a growing sense of wonder at these 3 young lives he had helped create. "I've missed so much," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ava, the quiet one, spoke up. "Mom's told us about you. She said you were changing the world." Edward felt his throat tighten. "Did she? And what do you think? Now that you've met me?" Olivia, never one to mince words, piped up. "You're taller than I thought you'd be, and your suit looks itchy." Despite everything, Edward found himself chuckling. "It is, a bit," he admitted, loosening his bow tie. Sophia, who had been studying him intently, asked, "Are you mad at us for ruining your wedding?" The question hit Edward like a physical blow. "No," he said quickly, leaning forward. "No, not at all. I'm glad to meet you, all of you. I wish I had known sooner." As the conversation continued, stilted and awkward at times, but slowly growing more natural, Edward felt himself being drawn into the world of these three remarkable girls. They were so different, yet so clearly sisters. Ava, thoughtful and observant. Olivia, bold and full of energy. Sophia, creative and sensitive. And through it all, there was Naomi. Watching her with the girls, Edward was struck by how naturally motherhood suited her. She had always had a nurturing spirit, but seeing her as a mother, their mother, awakened feelings in him he thought he'd buried long ago. As the hours passed, Edward found himself laughing at Olivia's jokes, marveling at Sophia's artistic talents, and engaging in a deep conversation with Ava about her favorite books. It was as if a door had opened to a life he never knew he wanted, but now couldn't imagine being without. But reality couldn't be held at bay forever. A soft knock at the door broke the bubble they had created. Edward's assistant poked her head in, her face a mask of professional calm despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Mr. Langston, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some matters that require your immediate attention. The guests, the vendors, and Miss Foster is asking to speak with you." The mention of Emily's name sent a jolt through Edward. In the whirlwind of discovering his daughters, he had almost forgotten about the woman he was supposed to have married today. The guilt hit him anew, along with a dawning realization that his life would never be the same. He looked at Naomi and the girls, then back to his assistant. "Tell them I'll be out shortly. And find a suite for Ms. Carter and the girls. They'll be staying here tonight." As his assistant nodded and withdrew, Edward turned back to his newfound family. "I have to go deal with everything, but I don't want you to leave. Can we talk more tomorrow? There's so much I want to know, so much to figure out." Naomi nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension on her face. "Of course, we're not going anywhere." The girls, picking up on the shift in mood, moved to hug Naomi. Edward watched, feeling like an outsider looking in on a family portrait. But then, to his surprise, Sophia broke away and approached him hesitantly. Can I hug you?" she asked, her voice small but determined. Edward felt his heart swell. "So of course you can," he said, opening his arms. As Sophia's small form pressed against him, soon joined by Ava and Olivia, Edward felt something shift inside him. The world he had built, the life he had planned, was crumbling around him. But in its place, something new and precious was taking root. He met Naomi's eyes over the girls' heads, seeing in them a reflection of his own turbulent emotions. They had a long road ahead, filled with explanations, apologies, and no doubt, conflicts. But in that moment, holding his daughters for the first time, Edward knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As he reluctantly pulled away and prepared to face the chaos waiting outside, Edward realized that the emptiness he had been trying to fill with success and status all these years had finally been filled. Not by the wedding that never happened, but by 3 young girls with his eyes and Naomi's smile. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Edward felt truly alive. The journey ahead would be difficult, but as he looked at Naomi and their daughters, he knew it would be worth every step. The days following the wedding, that wasn't passed in a whirlwind of emotions and confrontations for Edward Langston. The opulent halls of the Omni Fort Worth Hotel, once buzzing with anticipation for his nuptials, now echoed with hushed whispers and speculative glances as he moved between crisis management meetings and tentative family gatherings. In the quiet of his penthouse suite, Edward stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghostly against the twinkling lights of the Fort Worth skyline. The bow tie that had felt so constricting on his wedding day now hung loosely around his neck, a tangible reminder of how quickly life could unravel. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The question encompassed more than just his current situation. It was a reflection on the path his life had taken, the choices he'd made, and the priorities he'd set. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. "Come in," he called, turning to see Naomi enter, her face a mix of concern and resolve. "The girls are asleep," she said, closing the door behind her. "I thought we could talk." Edward nodded, gesturing to the plush seating area. As they sat, an awkward silence fell between them, years of unspoken words and missed opportunities hanging in the air. "I'm sorry," they both blurted out simultaneously, then shared a rueful smile at the coincidence. "Ladies first," Edward offered, leaning back in his chair. Naomi took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for keeping the girls a secret from you for so long. It wasn't fair to you or to them. I thought I was protecting everyone, but I see now that I was wrong." Edward listened, his fingers drumming an absent rhythm on the armrest. "I appreciate that, Naomi, but I'm struggling to understand how you could make that decision. We were together for years. Did you really think I wouldn't want to know my own children?" "It wasn't about you not wanting them," Naomi explained, her voice soft but steady. "It was about the life you were building. You were so focused on your career, on becoming successful. A family, it just didn't seem to fit into that picture. That should have been my choice to make," Edward countered, a hint of anger creeping into his tone. "You're right," Naomi conceded, "and that's part of why I'm sorry. I made a decision that affected all of us, based on fear and assumptions. I can't change the past, Edward, but I'm here now, trying to make it right." Edward stood, pacing the room as he grappled with his emotions. "Do you know what it's like?" he asked, his voice raw. "To suddenly discover you're a father? To realize you've missed 9 years of your children's lives? First steps, first words, first everything?" Naomi's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I can't imagine how overwhelming this must be for you. But Edward, you haven't missed everything. There's still so much ahead, so many firsts you can be part of." Her words gave him pause. He turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since that fateful moment in the ballroom. She was older, of course, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry, but her gaze still held that same strength and compassion that had first drawn him to her all those years ago. "Tell me about them," he said suddenly, returning to his seat. "The girls, what are they like?" A smile bloomed on Naomi's face, transforming her features. "They're amazing, Edward. Each one so unique, yet so clearly sisters." She launched into a detailed description of each girl. Ava's quiet intelligence, Olivia's fierce determination, Sophia's creative spirit. As Edward listened, he felt a strange mix of pride and loss. These remarkable young women were his daughters, a part of him, yet strangers at the same time. "I want to know them," he said when Naomi finished. "I want to be part of their lives, but I don't know how. I don't know how to be a father." Naomi reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing her hand on his. "No one really knows at first. We learn as we go. And the girls, they want to know you too. They have so many questions." The conversation stretched into the early hours of the morning, Edward and Naomi navigating the complex emotions and practicalities of their new reality. By the time Naomi left to check on the girls, Edward felt both exhausted and oddly invigorated. The life he had planned lay in shambles around him, but from the ruins, something new and precious was emerging. The next few days saw Edward taking his first tentative steps into fatherhood. He cancelled meetings, delegated tasks, and for the first time in years put his personal life before his business. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from concerned board members and curious journalists, but he ignored them all, focusing instead on the 3 young lives that had so suddenly become the center of his world. One sunny afternoon found Edward in a nearby park with the triplets, the 4 of them seated on a checkered picnic blanket. He had shed his usual suit for casual jeans and a polo shirt, feeling oddly vulnerable without his usual armor of designer labels. "So," he began, his voice uncertain, "what would you like to do? We could go for ice cream, or maybe visit the zoo." Ava, ever the practical one, tilted her head thoughtfully. "Could you tell us about your work? Mom says you build things." Edward blinked, surprised by the request. "Well, yes, in a way. I develop properties, buildings, shopping centers, that sort of thing." "Like Legos?" Sophia chimed in, her eyes lighting up. A chuckle escaped Edward's lips. "I suppose it is a bit like Legos, just on a much larger scale." "That's boring," Olivia declared, flopping back on the blanket. "I want to do something fun. Can we go rock climbing?" "Rock climbing?" Edward repeated, a hint of panic in his voice. "I'm not sure that's a good idea. It could be dangerous." Olivia sat up, fixing him with a determined stare that was eerily reminiscent of his own. "Mom takes us all the time. We're really good at it." "Does she now?" Edward murmured, making a mental note to discuss safety concerns with Naomi. But looking at Olivia's eager face, he found himself nodding. All right, we can look into rock climbing. But for now, how about we start with something a little closer to the ground? The afternoon unfolded in a series of small, precious moments. Edward found himself being schooled in the art of daisy chain making by Sophia, discussing favorite books with Ava, and engaging in a spirited game of tag instigated by Olivia. By the time they returned to the hotel, all four were disheveled, grass-stained, and grinning. As the days passed, Edward found himself falling into a rhythm with the girls. He learned that Ava loved puzzles and could spend hours working on complex jigsaw designs. Olivia had a passion for sports and could rattle off baseball statistics with impressive accuracy. Sophia was the artist of the trio, always carrying a sketchbook and seeing the world in vibrant colors and shapes. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of awkwardness, of uncertainty. Times when Edward reached out for a hug and one of the girls shied away, not yet comfortable with this new person in their lives. Instances where he said the wrong thing, used words that were too adult, or made references the girls didn't understand. One particularly challenging moment came during a quiet evening in the hotel suite. Edward had ordered room service, and they were all gathered around the coffee table, the remains of their meal spread before them. "So," Edward began, trying to sound casual, "how would you girls feel about coming to live with me? I have a big house with plenty of room, and there's a great school nearby." The silence that followed was deafening. The girls exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them that Edward couldn't decipher. Finally, Ava spoke up, her voice small but firm. "We like our house and our school. All our friends are there." "Yeah," Olivia chimed in, a hint of defiance in her tone. "And Mom's there. We're not leaving, Mom." Edward backpedaled quickly, realizing his mistake. "Of course not. I didn't mean... I wouldn't want to separate you from your mother. I just thought maybe we could all..." "You want Mom to live with you too?" Sophia asked, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and confusion. That's not..." Edward fumbled for words, acutely aware that he was navigating emotional waters far deeper than any business negotiation he'd ever faced. Naomi, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, stepped in. "Girls, your father is just trying to figure out how we can all be a family. But don't worry, no one's going to make you leave your home or your school. We're going to take things slow and figure it out together, okay?" The girls nodded, visibly relaxing at their mother's reassurance. Edward shot Naomi a grateful look, once again in awe of her ability to navigate these complex emotional situations with such grace. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Edward and Naomi sat on the balcony, the warm Texas night enveloping them. "I'm making a mess of this, aren't I?" Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. Naomi shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're learning, we all are. This isn't a situation any of us were prepared for." "How do you do it?" he asked, genuine admiration in his voice. "You always seem to know exactly what to say, how to handle every situation." "Practice," Naomi replied with a soft laugh. 9 years of practice, and believe me, I've made my share of mistakes along the way." As they talked, Edward found himself opening up about his fears and insecurities in a way he never had before. He spoke of his worry that he'd never catch up on the years he'd missed, his fear of disappointing the girls, his uncertainty about how to balance his new role as a father with the demands of his business. Naomi listened, offering advice where she could and simple understanding where she couldn't. As the night wore on, Edward felt a shift in their relationship, no longer exes tiptoeing around old hurts, but partners united in their love for their children. But while Edward's personal life was slowly finding its footing, his professional world was in chaos. The news of his cancelled wedding and newly discovered family had spread like wildfire through Fort Worth's business community. Investors were nervous, partners were asking questions, and the press was having a field day with speculation and rumors. Emily, hurt and humiliated, had left the hotel the day after the failed wedding. Her parting words to Edward had been scathing, accusing him of using her as a placeholder, of never truly being committed to their relationship. The guilt weighed heavily on Edward, even as he knew that ending their engagement was the right thing to do. A week after the wedding that wasn't, Edward finally returned to his office. The familiar surroundings of Langston Real Estate's headquarters felt strangely alien now, as if he were returning to a life that belonged to someone else. His assistant, Linda, greeted him with a sympathetic smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Langston. The board has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon, and Mr. Holloway from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram has been calling non-stop for a statement. Edward nodded, steeling himself for the battles ahead. Thank you, Linda. Hold all my calls for now except family. And can you get me the latest projections on the Riverside development? I have a feeling that's going to be a topic of discussion at the board meeting. As he settled behind his desk, Edward's eyes fell on a framed photo of himself shaking hands with the mayor at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It had always been one of his proudest moments, a symbol of all he had achieved. Now it seemed hollow somehow, a relic of a life that no longer fit. With a decisive motion, he turned the frame face down. Then, reaching into his briefcase, he pulled out a hastily snapped photo of himself with the girls at the park. It wasn't perfect. Olivia was mid-blink, and Edward's hair was mussed from their game of tag, but it captured a moment of genuine joy. He propped it up on his desk, a reminder of what truly mattered now. The board meeting was every bit as challenging as Edward had anticipated. The other executives, men and women he had worked alongside for years, regarded him with a mix of concern and skepticism. Edward, began Harold Winters, the eldest board member, we're all concerned about recent events. The cancelled wedding, these rumors about a secret family, it's causing unrest among our investors. Edward nodded, understanding their worries. I know this has come as a shock to everyone. It was a shock to me too, but I want to assure you all that my commitment to this company hasn't changed. If anything, I'm more motivated than ever to ensure our continued success. And these children? Asked Sarah Patel, her tone carefully neutral. How will they impact your ability to lead this company? For a moment, Edward felt a flash of his old anger, the desire to assert his authority and shut down any questioning of his capabilities. But then he thought of Ava's thoughtful gaze, Olivia's determined spirit, Sophia's creative soul. He thought of Naomi and the strength she'd shown in raising their daughters alone. My daughters, he began, emphasizing the word, have opened my eyes to a lot of things. They've made me realize that there's more to life than just business success. But they've also reminded me why we do what we do, to build a better future, to create spaces where families can thrive. He paused, looking around the room at the faces of his colleagues. I won't pretend that balancing my new family responsibilities with my role here will be easy, but I believe it will make me a better leader, more in touch with the needs of the communities we serve, and I'm committed to making it work. The meeting continued, delving into financial projections and development plans. Edward found himself approaching each topic with a new perspective, considering not just the bottom line, but the impact on families, on children like his daughters. As the days turned into weeks, Edward slowly began to find his footing in his new reality. He adjusted his work schedule, carving out time each day to spend with the girls. He learned to change meetings to make it to school plays and soccer games. He discovered the joy of bedtime stories and the challenge of helping with homework. There were still moments of doubt, times when he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the change in his life, but then Ava would ask him a thoughtful question about his work, or Olivia would challenge him to a race in the park, or Sophia would present him with a carefully drawn picture of their growing family. And in those moments, Edward knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. One sunny Saturday, about a month after the fateful wedding day, Edward found himself back in the park where he'd first really connected with his daughters. This time, Naomi was with them, and the five of them were engaged in an elaborate game of make-believe orchestrated by Sophia. As he watched Naomi twirl Olivia around, both of them laughing, Edward felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. He caught Naomi's eye and they shared a smile of partnership, of shared joy in the family they had created. There were still challenges ahead. Edward knew that merging his world with Naomi's and the girls wouldn't be easy. There would be logistical hurdles, emotional hurdles, moments of doubt and frustration. The business world was still adjusting to this new Edward Langston, and there were sure to be more professional challenges on the horizon. But as he sat there in the park, surrounded by the laughter of his daughters and the warm presence of Naomi, Edward felt a sense of peace he'd never known before. He had spent so many years chasing success, thinking it would fill the emptiness inside him. Now he realized that what he'd been missing all along was right here, the love of family, the joy of connection, the fulfillment of being truly known and accepted. Edward Langston, business tycoon, was still a part of who he was, but now he was also Edward Langston, father, partner, a man learning to balance ambition with love, success with fulfillment. And as he looked at the faces of his newfound family, he knew that this messy, complicated, beautiful new life was the greatest success he could ever achieve. The Fort Worth skyline glittered in the early morning light as Edward Langston stood at the window of his penthouse office, a cup of coffee cooling, forgotten in his hand. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere, caught between two worlds that seemed increasingly difficult to reconcile. It had been 3 months since the wedding that wasn't, 3 months of juggling board meetings and bedtime stories, contract negotiations and parent-teacher conferences. Edward had thrown himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he'd always applied to his business dealings, determined to make up for lost time with his daughters. But as the initial shock and novelty wore off, the realities of his new life began to set in. The long-established rhythms of his work life clashed with the unpredictable demands of family life. Late-night strategy sessions were interrupted by calls from Naomi about a sick child. Important client meetings competed for attention with school events and family dinners. A knock at the door pulled Edward from his reverie. "Come in," he called, turning to see Linda, his assistant, enter with a stack of files. "Mr. Langston, here are the reports for this morning's meeting," she said, placing them on his desk. "Also, Ms. Patel called again about the Riverside project. She's concerned about the delays." Edward nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The Riverside development was the largest project Langston Real Estate had ever undertaken, a mixed-use complex that promised to revitalize a struggling neighborhood. It was also proving to be one of the most challenging, with unexpected environmental issues and community pushback causing significant delays. "Thank you, Linda," he said, moving to his desk. "Tell Sarah I'll call her back this afternoon. And can you push my 2 p.m. to 3? I promised Olivia I'd watch her soccer game." Linda hesitated, a small frown creasing her brow. "Sir, the 2 p.m. is with the mayor, about the zoning issues for Riverside. I'm not sure we can reschedule." Edward felt a flash of frustration, quickly followed by guilt. He'd promised Olivia he'd be there. She'd been talking about this game for weeks, proud to have been chosen as a starter, but the meeting with the mayor was crucial for moving the Riverside project forward. "Right," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Of course. The meeting stays. I'll make it up to Olivia." As Linda left, Edward sank into his chair, the weight of his competing responsibilities pressing down on him. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over Naomi's number. He should call her, let her know he couldn't make the game. But the thought of disappointing Olivia, of missing another important moment in his daughters' lives, made his chest tighten. Before he could make a decision, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Harold Winters, the head of the board. "Edward," Harold's gruff voice came through the speaker. "We need to talk about Riverside. The board's getting nervous. Cost overruns, delays, community protests. Some are suggesting we cut our losses and sell the property." Edward felt a surge of anger. "Sell? Harold, we can't just abandon this project. We made promises to that community. This development could change lives." "I understand that, Edward," Harold replied, his tone softening slightly. "But we have a responsibility to our shareholders, and frankly, some of us are concerned that your personal situation is affecting your judgment." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Edward's newfound family responsibilities were being seen as a liability, a distraction from the ruthless focus that had made him successful. "My personal life has nothing to do with this," Edward said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Riverside is a sound investment. We just need more time." "Time is money, Edward," Harold reminded him. "And money is something our investors are increasingly concerned we're losing. We've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. I suggest you come prepared to make a strong case for continuing this project." The call ended, leaving Edward staring at his phone, a mix of anger and determination coursing through him. He'd built this company from the ground up, navigated countless challenges. He wouldn't let it fall apart now, wouldn't let anyone question his commitment or capability. With renewed focus, Edward dove into his work, poring over reports and financial projections. Hours slipped by unnoticed as he built his case for the Riverside project, determined to prove that it was not only viable, but vital. It wasn't until his phone buzzed with a text message that he realized how much time had passed. It was from Naomi. "Olivia was amazing, scored the winning goal, wish you could have seen it. The message was like a punch to the gut. Edward glanced at his watch, realizing with a sinking feeling that he had completely missed the game. He'd been so caught up in work, in proving himself to the board, that he'd forgotten about his promise to his daughter. Guilt washed over him as he quickly typed out a reply. "I'm so sorry I missed it. Got caught up in a work emergency. Please tell Olivia how proud I am of her. I'll make it up to her, I promise." Naomi's response came a few moments later. "She understands." "But Edward, this is the third time this month. The girls are starting to notice." The words stung, all the more because Edward knew they were true. He'd been cancelling plans more often lately, always with the promise to make it up later. But later never seemed to come, always pushed aside by the next crisis, the next meeting, the next deal. As he gathered his things to head home, Edward felt torn between two worlds, both demanding his full attention, both integral to who he was. He loved his daughters fiercely, cherished every moment with them. But he also loved his work, the challenge and satisfaction of building something lasting. The next day dawned bright and clear, a beautiful Texas morning that belied the storm brewing in Edward's professional life. He arrived at the office early, determined to be fully prepared for the board meeting that afternoon. As he walked through the lobby, he overheard two employees talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear? They're saying Langston's lost his edge. Too focused on playing happy families to keep the business on track. Can you blame him? 3 kids he never knew about. I'd be distracted too." Edward kept walking, his jaw clenched, but the words echoed in his mind. Was that what people thought? That he'd lost his edge? That he couldn't handle both his family and his business responsibilities? The morning passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Edward was in the middle of a heated discussion with the Riverside project manager when his phone buzzed with a call from Naomi. "Edward," Naomi's voice was tight with worry. "It's Sophia. She fell at school and hit her head. The nurse thinks she might have a concussion. We're on our way to the hospital now." Edward felt his heart drop. "Is she okay? Which hospital? I'll meet you there." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Cook Children's Medical Center." "But Edward," the girls were asking, "don't you have that big meeting today?" The board meeting. In all the chaos, he'd almost forgotten. Edward glanced at his watch. The meeting was scheduled to start in less than an hour. Yes, I do," he admitted, feeling the familiar pull of competing obligations. "But this is more important. I'll be there as soon as I can." As he entered the call, Edward's mind raced. He needed to get to the hospital, needed to be there for Sophia. But he also knew that missing this board meeting could have serious consequences for the future of his company and the Riverside project. For a moment, he stood frozen in indecision. Then, with a sudden clarity, he knew what he had to do. Edward burst into the boardroom where the other executives were already gathered. All eyes turned to him as he entered, some curious, some wary. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I know we're here to discuss the future of the Riverside project, and I came prepared to make a case for why we should continue, why this development is not just good business, but vital for our community." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of people he'd worked alongside for years. "But something's come up. My daughter, Sophia, is in the hospital, and I need to be there." A murmur went through the room. Harold Winters leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Edward, I understand this is a difficult situation, but this meeting—" Edward held up a hand, cutting him off. "I know how important this meeting is. I know what's at stake. But I also know that if I stay here, if I choose this meeting over being with my daughter when she needs me, I'll be making the wrong choice." He took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders as he spoke. "I've spent years putting this company first, believing that success in business was the most important thing. But I was wrong. My family, my daughters, they're what truly matter." The room was silent, all eyes fixed on Edward as he continued. "I'm not abandoning this company or the Riverside project. I believe in what we're doing, in the positive impact we can have, but I'm also not going to sacrifice my family for it. So I'm asking you all to trust me, to believe that I can be both a good father and a good leader, to give me the chance to prove that having a family doesn't make me weak. It makes me stronger, more empathetic, more in touch with the people we're trying to serve with projects like Riverside." Edward looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "I'm going to the hospital now to be with my daughter, but I'll be back tomorrow, ready to fight for Riverside and for the future of this company. A future that I hope will be built on not just profits, but on values, on family, on community. With that, Edward turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. As he rushed to his car, he felt a mix of terror and exhilaration. He had no idea how the board would react, what consequences his actions might have. But for the first time in months, he felt truly at peace with his decision. At the hospital, Edward found Naomi in the waiting room. Ava and Olivia huddled close to her. The girls looked up as he approached, their faces lighting up. "Dad, you came!" Olivia exclaimed, jumping up to hug him. "Of course I came," Edward said, holding her tight. "Nothing's more important than you girls." Naomi stood, surprise and something like pride in her eyes. "But your meeting—" Edward shook his head. "It doesn't matter. This is where I need to be." As they waited for news about Sophia, Edward filled Naomi in on what had happened at the office. She listened, her eyes widening. "Edward," she said softly when he finished, "are you sure about this? Your company has been my whole life for too long." Edward finished for her. "It's time for that to change." Just then a doctor approached them. "Mr. and Mrs. Langston, Sophia's going to be fine. She has a mild concussion, but with rest, she'll recover fully." The wave of relief that washed over Edward was unlike anything he'd ever felt. As they were led to Sophia's room, he felt Naomi's hand slip into his, a gesture of support and unity. Sophia was sitting up in bed, a bandage on her forehead, but a smile on her face when she saw her family. "Daddy, you're here." Edward moved to her bedside, gently enveloping her in a hug. "Of course I'm here, sweetheart. I'll always be here when you need me. I promise." As he held his daughter, surrounded by his family, Edward felt the last pieces of his old life falling away. The man who had been willing to sacrifice everything for success was gone, replaced by a father who understood what truly mattered. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. True to his word, Edward returned to the office the day after Sophia's accident, ready to fight for the Riverside project and his new vision for the company. To his surprise, he found more support than he expected. His honesty and commitment had struck a chord with many on the board, who saw in Edward's transformation a chance for the company to evolve as well. The Riverside project moved forward with a renewed focus on community engagement and sustainable development. Edward found that his experiences as a father gave him new insights into what families and communities really needed, leading to innovations in design and planning that set Langston Real Estate apart from its competitors. But the biggest changes were in Edward's personal life. He adjusted his work schedule, making sure to be home for dinner most nights and never missing another important event in his daughters' lives. He and Naomi worked together to create a new normal for their unconventional family, their old romance slowly rekindling into something deeper and more mature. One evening, about 6 months after the fateful non-wedding day, Edward stood in the backyard of Naomi's house, now their house. The girls were playing an elaborate game of their own invention, their laughter filling the air. Naomi stood beside him, her hand in his, a contented smile on her face. "I never thought we'd be here," she said softly. "Sometimes I still can't believe it." Edward squeezed her hand, watching as Olivia showed off a cartwheel, while Ava and Sophia cheered. "I know what you mean, but I wouldn't change it for anything." As the Texas sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Edward Langston felt a profound sense of peace. He had faced the crisis, made his choice, and in doing so, had found a balance he never knew was possible. His life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges at work, still moments of doubt and difficulty in navigating his new role as a father. But for the first time, he felt truly whole. The man who had once measured his worth by the size of his deals and the height of his buildings, now found his greatest achievement in the love of his family. And as he stood there surrounded by the warmth of the home he had found, Edward knew that this messy, complicated, beautiful life was the greatest success he could ever have imagined. The gentle hum of conversation and clinking glasses filled the air as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the backyard of the Langston Carter home. Fairy lights twinkled in the trees, and the aroma of barbecue wafted from the grill where Edward stood, spatula in hand, a look of contentment on his face that would have been unrecognizable to those who knew him just a year ago. It was the eve of the triplets' 10th birthday, and the extended family had gathered to celebrate. Naomi moved among the guests, her laugh ringing out as she shared stories with Edward's sister, Claire, who had flown in from New York for the occasion. The girls darted between the adults, excitement evident in their voices, as they showed off the elaborate decorations they had helped create. As Edward flipped burgers on the grill, his mind wandered over the events of the past year. The months following his decision to prioritize his family had been a whirlwind of change, challenges, and unexpected joys. His bold move at the board meeting had indeed sent shockwaves through Langston Real Estate, but not in the way he had feared. "I need a hand there, Chief." The voice pulled Edward from his reverie. He looked up to see Harold Winters, his once stern face now creased in a friendly smile. "Harold, glad you could make it," Edward grinned, handing over the spatula. "Be my guest. I was just about to check on the corn." As Harold took over grilling duties, Edward couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. The older man had been one of his harshest critics in the early days of Edward's transformation, skeptical of his ability to balance family life with the demands of running a major corporation. Now here he was, a guest at a family barbecue, looking as comfortable as if he'd been doing this for years. "You know," Harold said, his voice low as he flipped a burger, "I owe you an apology, Edward. I thought you were losing your edge, that this family business would be the end of Langston Real Estate. I've never been happier to be proven wrong." Edward clapped him on the shoulder. "No apologies necessary, Harold. I had my own doubts in the beginning, but I've learned that having a family, understanding what really matters to people, it's made me a better leader, a better businessman." And it was true. The past year had seen Langston Real Estate not just survive Edward's shift in priorities, but thrive. The Riverside project, once on the brink of being scrapped, had become a crowning achievement. By truly engaging with the community, listening to their needs and concerns, they had created a development that was not just profitable, but genuinely improved people's lives. The success of Riverside had led to a shift in the company's overall strategy. Under Edward's guidance, Langston Real Estate had begun to focus more on sustainable community-oriented projects. They weren't just building structures anymore, they were building neighborhoods, creating spaces where families could grow and communities could flourish. As if on cue, Olivia came bounding up, her eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, can I show Mr. Winters my model of the new community center? Please?" Edward chuckled, ruffling her hair affectionately. "If Mr. Winters is interested, sweetheart. Don't forget he's here to relax, not talk business." But Harold was already setting down the spatula, a look of genuine interest on his face. "I'd love to see it, young lady. Lead the way." As Olivia dragged Harold off towards the house, chattering animatedly about her ideas for a rooftop garden and solar panels, Edward felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the grill's heat. His daughter's passion for architecture and community planning was a source of constant amazement and pride. She had taken to visiting his office after school, poring over blueprints and peppering the designers with questions. "Looks like Olivia's found another victim for her grand designs." Naomi's voice came from behind him, tinged with amusement. She slipped an arm around his waist, and he turned to pull her close, planting a kiss on her forehead. "Harold doesn't stand a chance," Edward agreed with a chuckle. "She'll have him agreeing to build tree houses in every project by the time she's done." As they stood together, watching their guests mingle and their daughters flit from group to group, Edward marveled at how far they'd come. The road hadn't always been smooth. There had been arguments, misunderstandings, moments when the weight of their past threatened to overshadow their future. But they had worked through it all, learning to communicate, to trust, to forgive. Naomi had struggled at first with allowing Edward into the well-established routines she had built with the girls. Years of being the sole decision-maker had made it difficult for her to step back and allow Edward to take on a parental role. There had been tense discussions about discipline styles, education choices, even bedtime routines. But as the months passed, they had found a rhythm, a way of co-parenting that played to both their strengths. Edward's structured approach balanced well with Naomi's more free-spirited nature. They learned to present a united front to the girls while still maintaining their individual relationships with each daughter. For Edward, the learning curve had been steep. He had to learn to navigate the complex world of pre-teen emotions, to balance his instinct, to solve problems with the need to simply listen and support. There were times when he felt completely out of his depth, like the day Ava came home in tears because a friend had called her weird for having two different houses. But for every challenge, There were moments of pure joy that made it all worthwhile. The first time all three girls called him Dad without hesitation. The look of pride on Sophia's face when he attended her first art show. The quiet evenings spent helping Ava with her math homework, marveling at her quick mind and thoughtful questions. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Naomi's voice brought Edward back to the present. He looked down at her, struck once again by how beautiful she was, how right it felt to have her by his side. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "A year ago I thought I had everything figured out. I thought success meant big deals and bigger profits. Now I know that true success is this: family, love, making a real difference in people's lives." Naomi's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she squeezed his hand. "We're all lucky, Edward. It hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't change a thing." Their moment was interrupted by a chorus of excited squeals as Ava and Sophia came running up, followed by a group of their friends. "Mom, Dad, can we have the cake now, please?" Sophia begged, her eyes wide with anticipation. Edward glanced at his watch, raising an eyebrow at Naomi. "What do you think? Is it cake time?" Naomi pretended to consider for a moment, tapping her chin thoughtfully as the girls bounced on their toes. "Well, I suppose it is getting close to bedtime. We wouldn't want to send everyone home on a sugar high, would we?" "Mom!" the girls protested in unison, giggling at Naomi's teasing. All right, Naomi laughed, holding up her hands in surrender. "Let's get everyone together for cake." As Edward helped Naomi bring out the enormous cake, 3 tiers for 3 girls, each layer decorated to reflect their individual personalities, he caught sight of his parents, standing off to the side with slightly bemused expressions. The relationship with his parents had been another hurdle to overcome in the past year. Initially shocked and somewhat scandalized by the dramatic turn of events at the wedding, they had struggled to accept the new reality of Edward's life. His mother, in particular, had been hurt by the idea that she had grandchildren she'd never known about. But as they saw the change in Edward, the joy and purpose that radiated from him whenever he was with his daughters, they had slowly come around. Now, watching them interact with the girls, Edward saw nothing but love and pride in their eyes. "All right, everyone," Edward called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Gather round. It's time to sing happy birthday to these 3 amazing young ladies." As the guests assembled, Edward felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see Ava, her face serious. "Dad," she said, her voice low, "I just wanted to say, I'm really glad you're here, that you're our dad." Edward felt his throat tighten with emotion. He knelt down, pulling Ava into a hug. "I'm glad too, sweetheart. So very glad." The cake was a hit, of course. As slices were passed around and the girls opened their gifts, Edward found himself in conversation with his former fiancée, Emily. Her presence at the party had been unexpected, but not unwelcome. "I have to admit," Emily said, a wry smile on her face, "when I got Naomi's invitation, I thought she must be joking. Or plotting some elaborate revenge." Edward chuckled, shaking his head. "Naomi's not the vengeful type. She just thought, well, we all thought it was time to put the past behind us." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad she did. And Edward, I'm happy for you, really. Seeing you with your girls, with Naomi, this is who you were always meant to be." As Emily moved away to chat with other guests, Edward felt the last vestiges of guilt and regret fall away. The path that had led him here had been unconventional, to say the least. There had been hurt and confusion along the way, but standing here now, surrounded by family and friends, he knew without a doubt that everything had worked out exactly as it was meant to. The party began to wind down as the night grew late. The girls, despite their protests, were beginning to yawn, their excitement finally giving way to exhaustion. As guests began to say their goodbyes, Edward and Naomi worked in tandem to start the cleanup process, moving with the easy synchronicity of a couple who had found their rhythm. "Leave that for tomorrow," Claire insisted, shooing them away from a stack of dirty plates. "I'll come over in the morning and help. You two deserve a break." Grateful for the offer, Edward and Naomi herded the sleepy girls upstairs for bed. The nightly routine of teeth brushing and story reading took longer than usual, with each girl wanting to recount their favorite moments from the party. Finally, with the triplets tucked in and drifting off to sleep, Edward and Naomi found themselves alone on the back porch, the remnants of the party spread out before them in the moonlight. "Quite a day," Naomi sighed, leaning her head on Edward's shoulder. "Quite a year," Edward amended, wrapping an arm around her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Edward found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment, the challenges they'd faced, the growth they'd experienced, the love that had blossomed anew between them. "You know," he said finally, his voice soft in the quiet night, "a year ago, if someone had told me this is where I'd be, a father of 3, living in a house with a backyard instead of a penthouse, more likely to be covered in glitter than closing million-dollar deals, I would have thought they were crazy." Naomi chuckled, the sound vibrating against his chest. "And now?" "Now," Edward said, turning to look into her eyes, "I can't imagine being anywhere else, doing anything else, being anyone else." He took a deep breath, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. "Naomi, I know we've done things in a pretty unconventional order, and I know we agreed to take things slow, to focus on the girls and on building our family. But I've been thinking—" Naomi sat up straighter, her eyes widening as Edward slid off the porch swing and onto one knee before her. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. "Naomi Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "you have given me the greatest gifts of my life, our beautiful daughters, a second chance at love, a reason to be a better man. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks as she nodded, too overcome for words. As Edward slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple, elegant design that suited her perfectly, she pulled him close for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Later, as they lay in bed, Naomi's head on Edward's chest and their fingers intertwined, Edward felt a sense of completion he had never known before. The journey that had brought them here had been long and often difficult. There had been mistakes made, hearts broken, years lost. But in the end, it had led them exactly where they were meant to be. As he drifted off to sleep, Edward Langston, businessman, father, soon-to-be husband, knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found his true measure of success. It wasn't in the buildings he'd raised or the deals he'd closed, but in the love of his family and the life they were building together, and he wouldn't have it any other way. 5 years later, the sun was setting over Fort Worth, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink as Edward Langston pulled into the driveway of his home. The house, a spacious but modest 2-story in a quiet neighborhood, was a far cry from the luxurious penthouse he'd once called home. But as he stepped out of his car, the sound of laughter drifting from the backyard brought a smile to his face that no amount of luxury could ever match. Edward made his way around the house, pausing at the gate to take in the scene before him. Naomi stood at an easel, paintbrush in hand, while their youngest daughter, 2-year-old Emma, sat at her feet, happily smearing paint on a large piece of paper. The triplets, now 15, were scattered around the yard. Ava sat cross-legged on the grass, deeply engrossed in a thick novel. Olivia was practicing soccer drills, her face a mask of concentration as she deftly maneuvered the ball. Sophia perched on a tree branch, sketchpad in hand, her pencil flying across the page as she captured the family scene below. "Dad's home," Olivia called out, abandoning her soccer ball to run and greet him. The others looked up, smiles breaking out across their faces. As Edward hugged each of his daughters in turn, he marveled at how much they'd grown. Ava, still the quietest of the 3, had blossomed into a thoughtful young woman with a passion for literature and philosophy. Olivia's athletic prowess had only increased with age, her determination and drive reminding Edward so much of himself at that age, and Sophia's artistic talents had flourished under Naomi's guidance, her unique vision earning her accolades at school and beyond. "How was your day?" Naomi asked, setting down her paintbrush to greet him with a kiss. The gold band on her finger caught the fading sunlight, a constant reminder of the vows they'd exchanged 3 years ago in a small, intimate ceremony right here in this very backyard. "Productive," Edward replied, scooping up Emma as she toddled over to him. "The community center project is finally moving forward. The city council approved our plans this afternoon." "That's wonderful news," Naomi beamed, knowing how much the project meant to him. The community center was the latest in a series of developments that reflected the new direction of Langston Real Estate. Under Edward's leadership, the company had shifted its focus to sustainable, community-oriented projects that prioritized people over profits. As the family gathered around the patio table for dinner, a nightly tradition they all cherished, Edward couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. The past 5 years hadn't always been easy. There had been growing pains as they all adjusted to their new reality, moments of doubt and frustration as they navigated the complexities of their blended family. But through it all, their love for each other had only grown stronger. Edward and Naomi had worked hard to build a partnership based on trust, respect, and open communication. They'd learned to balance each other's strengths and weaknesses, creating a home filled with love, creativity, and support. The triplets had flourished in this environment. While they still had their moments of teenage angst and sibling rivalry, they had grown into confident, compassionate young women. Edward watched with pride as Ava explained a complex philosophical concept to her sisters, her eyes alight with passion for the subject. He smiled as Olivia regaled them with tales from her latest soccer tournament, her natural leadership skills shining through. And his heart swelled as Sophia shyly shared her latest artwork, her talent a beautiful blend of Edward's precision and Naomi's creativity. As the sun dipped below the horizon and stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, the conversation turned to plans for the future. Ava spoke of her desire to study abroad, her thirst for knowledge driving her to explore the world. Olivia debated the merits of different college soccer programs, her ambition to play professionally burning bright. Sophia discussed her upcoming art show, nervous excitement coloring her voice as she described the pieces she planned to display. Edward listened to it all, offering advice and encouragement where needed, but mostly just marveling at the incredible young women his daughters had become. He caught Naomi's eye across the table, seeing in her gaze the same mix of pride and nostalgia he felt. Later, after the girls had retreated to their rooms and Emma had been tucked into bed, Edward and Naomi stood on the back porch, arms wrapped around each other as they gazed up at the star-filled sky. "Do you ever wonder," Naomi asked softly, "what would have happened if I hadn't come to your wedding that day?" Edward was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I look at our life, at our girls, and I know that somehow, some way we would have found our way back to each other. This is where we were always meant to be." Naomi nodded, snuggling closer to him. "It's funny, isn't it? How life has a way of working out, even when it seems like everything's falling apart." Edward thought back to that day 5 years ago, when his carefully constructed world had come crashing down around him. He remembered the fear, the anger, the confusion, but mostly he remembered the moment he first laid eyes on his daughters, the instant connection he'd felt, the love that had bloomed in his heart. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think success was about building the tallest buildings, closing the biggest deals, but now I know that true success is this: the love of family, the satisfaction of making a real difference in people's lives, the joy of watching our children grow and thrive." Naomi smiled up at him, her eyes shining with love. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Edward nodded, pulling her close. "We have, and the journey's only just beginning." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms under the vast Texas sky, Edward Langston felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. The path that had led him here had been winding and sometimes difficult, but every step had been worth it. He had found his true calling, not in the boardrooms and high-rises of the business world, but here in this backyard, surrounded by the love of his family. The man who had once measured his worth by the size of his bank account now knew that the greatest wealth was the love that filled his heart. And as the stars twinkled overhead, a silent witness to this moment of quiet joy, Edward knew with absolute certainty that he was the richest man in the world. Stories like this have the power to touch the heart and enlighten the mind. If you felt that, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters of this emotional journey. There's always another story that can brighten your day, and who knows, the next video might be exactly what you need. Click now and we'll see you there.